Well, the Berlin Wall was built as a response to refugees essentially fleeing East Berlin and moving into West Berlin. What you've got to understand is that in 1961, Berlin itself was a divided city. West Berlin was occupied by the Western powers from World War II, that's Britain and France, and essentially East Berlin was effectively controlled and occupied by the Russians, the communist Russians. So it was really a battleground between the capitalist West and the communist East. And because life in East Berlin was not as free because of the restrictions under communism, to put it simply, many people were fleeing what they felt were the controlled, unfree, less democratic East Berlin and moving to West Berlin. And of course, this posed a real threat. Khrushchev, who was the president of the USSR at the time, wanted to maintain his control in East Berlin because East Berlin was strategically a very important city in the Cold War. It didn't make sense for him if people were fleeing communist East Berlin to go to capitalist West Berlin. It didn't really it wasn't a great advert, if you like, for communism. So the wall was eventually erected. First it was a barricade, and eventually a concrete wall was built to stop people fleeing East Berlin in order to preserve, if you like, the strength of East Berlin as a communist stronghold. Now that didn't mean it didn't stop. Didn't mean that people didn't attempt to try and scale the wall and get into West Berlin. But effectively a city, once the capital of Germany, was divided in half between communist East Berlin and capitalist West Berlin. The problem was, in a sense, that the country where communism, the mother country for communism was Russia. And Russia obviously was keen to keep part of Berlin, East Berlin, under communist control in order to keep their influence as westwards as possible into Europe. But the collapse of the Berlin Wall could not have happened if it wasn't for what happened in Russia. Under a Russian leader in the 1980s called Gorbachev, there were two things occurred, something called glasnost and perestroika. Basically, to keep it very simple for you, those two things meant that things in Russia became more free, more liberal. People could question their leaders more. People could challenge communism more. And it was the beginnings of people questioning whether communism was the right way to live in Russia, had a ripple effect throughout the Eastern Europe, the communist countries.